There are places in the Mojave Desert that shouldn't exist, places that contradict everything you think you know about American geography, and yet they are real, documented, and still standing in the desert today. People come to the Mojave expecting heat, emptiness, and a certain kind of silence. What they don't expect is a classified airbase the government refused to admit existed for 60 years. Or rocks the size of bowling balls that move themselves across the desert floor in the dark while nobody is watching. Or a Broadway dancer who walked off a Manhattan stage in 1967, painted her own audience onto the walls of a desert hall, and performed for the painted figures for the next 44 years. The Mojave holds things that have no business being out here. These are 7 of the strangest, and I want to start with the one that surprised me the most. Place 1. Area 51. The airbase the United States government refused to admit existed for 58 years. When you picture America's most classified military base, you probably picture chain-link fences in the desert, a sign that says no trespassing, and almost nothing else. The actual story is older and stranger. In April 1955, a CIA officer named Richard Bissell flew over a dry lake bed called Groom Lake in southern Nevada, scouting a remote site to test a new high-altitude spy plane. The lake bed sat 83 miles north of Las Vegas, buffered by the Nellis bombing range, invisible from any public road. President Eisenhower personally signed off on the acquisition. Lockheed's Kelly Johnson, who designed the aircraft, started calling the base Paradise Ranch to make it easier to recruit workers. The name on the maps was Area 51. He never meant to fly. On August 1, 1955, Lockheed test pilot Tony LeVere was running a high-speed taxi test of the first U-2 prototype, when, at 70 knots, the aircraft lifted off the lake bed on its own. In his own words from the CIA archive, "I had no intentions whatsoever of flying. I immediately started back toward the ground, but had difficulty determining my height because the lake bed had no markings to judge distance or height." He landed minutes later on blown tires and burning brakes. Over the next 30 years, every classified American aircraft of consequence flew out of Area 51 first. The U-2, the Mach 3 A-12 Oxcart, the Have Blue Stealth Demonstrator, the F-117 Nighthawk. All of them flew at altitudes commercial aviation could not yet reach. And here is the part that got me. According to the CIA's own later admission, U-2 test flights in the 1950s and early 1960s were directly responsible for a tremendous increase in UFO sightings across the American Southwest. The most secret aircraft program of the Cold War was the engine of American flying saucer mythology. The base itself was never publicly acknowledged until August 15, 2013, when the CIA released a declassified U-2 history that named Area 51 and placed it on a map for the first time. 58 years after the first flight. Even now, after the acknowledgement, the closest a civilian can legally get to the perimeter is Tikaboo Peak, a 7,915-foot summit 26 miles east, reached by a dirt road and a 1.5-mile hike. From there, with a telephoto lens, you can just make out hangars and an airstrip shimmering across the heat. An airstrip that stretches more than 12,000 feet, longer than the main runway at Los Angeles International Airport. Everything around it is government land, patrolled by armed security contractors in unmarked vehicles, known locally as the Camo Dudes. And every morning, the workers themselves arrive on a fleet of unmarked Boeing 737s operating under the call sign Janet, flying out of a private terminal at Harry Reid International Airport in Las Vegas. They have been doing this in plain sight since 1972. For most of the 20th century, the official position of the United States government was that none of it existed. Place 2. Racetrack Playa. The dry lake bed where 700-pound rocks move themselves across the ground. Picture this, in the northern reaches of Death Valley, 27 miles down a punishing dirt road, there is a dry lake bed about 3 miles long and 1.5 miles wide. The clay surface is cracked into perfect polygons. Embedded in that clay are hundreds of rocks of varying sizes, some smaller than a fist, some weighing as much as 700 pounds. about the weight of an upright piano. The rocks came from a dolomite outcrop on the north end of the playa called the Grandstand, a rocky island a few feet above the lakebed, the only vertical element in an otherwise completely horizontal landscape. They sit on the cracked clay, and behind each one is a long, curving track running across the lakebed, sometimes hundreds of feet long, sometimes branching at angles, sometimes turning back on themselves. What makes the racetrack genuinely strange is not the rocks themselves, but what the rocks do when no one is watching. They have moved. For nearly a century, nobody had ever seen them do it. The first person to write the phenomenon down was a prospector named Joseph Crook from Fallon, Nevada, in 1915. And in the 65 years that followed, researchers proposed powerful winds, magnetism, dust devils, even algae mats. And none of it was ever observed in motion. The mystery survived every theory thrown at it. And then, almost by accident, it was solved. Not by a famous scientist or a dedicated research expedition, by two cousins who happened to be standing in the right place on the right morning. In December 2013, a paleobiologist named Richard Norris and his engineer cousin James Norris had come out to find the lakebed flooded with 3 inches of water from a recent storm. Exactly the conditions they had been waiting for. On the morning of December 21st, the surface froze overnight into a sheet of windowpane ice, 3 to 6 millimeters thick. And as the sun came up, a light breeze of somewhere between 7 and 11 miles per hour began breaking that ice into floating panels that pushed against the rocks. Richard Norris said only one thing on camera: "My God, Jim, it's happening." What they watched, and what was finally filmed that morning, was the rocks moving at roughly 15 feet per minute across the wet clay. Some moved 224 meters before the ice melted. The conditions that produce the phenomenon occur on a roughly decade-scale frequency. The tracks themselves can persist for years before being erased by rain. In August 2016, an unidentified driver took an SUV onto the playa and carved approximately 10 miles of looping tire tracks across its surface, described by park officials as the worst case of vandalism they had ever seen. A team of volunteers spent 2 years erasing the damage by hand. In the driest place in North America, where rainfall averages 2 inches a year, the rocks of the racetrack are shoved across the desert floor by the same mechanism that shifts ice in the Arctic. Place 3. The Integratron. The wooden dome a credentialed aerospace engineer spent 21 years building to instructions from a man from Venus. I know how this one sounds, but every part of it is documented. George Van Tassel was not a fringe figure. Born in Ohio in 1910, he spent 11 years at Douglas Aircraft, then became a personal flight inspector of experimental aircraft for Howard Hughes, and after that worked on Lockheed Constellations, holding a pilot's license, inspecting aircraft for one of the most secretive industrialists in the country. And then in 1947, for reasons he never fully explained, he walked away from all of it. He leased 2,600 acres of high desert near Landers, California, and moved his wife and 3 daughters out to live beneath a freestanding granite boulder called Giant Rock, a boulder that had already been the obsession of someone else. A German prospector named Frank Kritzer had carved underground rooms beneath that rock in the 1930s and died inside them in 1942, when dynamite he had stored exploded during a visit from sheriff's deputies. Van Tassel moved into the very rooms Kritzer had carved, opened a small airport, and began hosting meditation sessions in the desert. And then, at 2 in the morning on August 24, 1953, the story takes a turn that nobody who knew his aerospace background could explain. Van Tassel claimed a being from Venus named Solgonda landed in a flying saucer outside his home and dictated to him the blueprints for a machine. The machine was the Integratron, and according to Van Tassel, it would rejuvenate human cells, enable time travel, and produce anti-gravity. He started construction in 1957 on a 38-foot-tall, 55-foot-wide wooden dome, built with no metal nails because he believed metal would disrupt the geomagnetic field beneath the site. What is strange is that he spoke about the structure the way an engineer speaks. The rotating armature inside it, the part that was supposed to do the actual rejuvenating, he described as a mechanical wonder with 16 Teflon-bearing blocks, each supplied with 120 pounds of compressed air, together floating a 1,700-pound spinner on a cushion of nothing. He funded the work by hosting annual UFO conventions at Giant Rock, drawing crowds in the thousands by 1958. And he kept working on the dome for 21 years, until February 9, 1978, when he died of a heart attack in a Pasadena hotel room with the building complete, but the rotating armature inside it never installed. The machine was never finished. The dome is still there. In 2000, 3 sisters named Joanne, Nancy, and Patty Carl bought the property and converted it into a sound bath venue, using the dome's naturally resonant acoustics. Visitors book 60-minute sessions, lying on mats inside while 7 quartz crystal bowls are played in the center of the room. Outside, the structure stands alone in flat desert, surrounded by Joshua trees, a polished white dome with no windows at ground level. From a distance, it looks ready to lift off. 3/4 of a mile away, the boulder Van Tassel lived beneath for decades is still there too. On February 20th, 2000, an enormous section of giant rock, approximately 1/8 of its mass, split off and fell spontaneously, revealing a brilliant white granite interior beneath the weathered exterior. A New Age religious group had been conducting a ceremony at the rock the night before. They interpreted the split as a sign. A man who inspected experimental aircraft for Howard Hughes spent 21 years building a machine in the Mojave to instructions he said were given to him by a visitor from Venus, and the building is still operating today. Place 4. Rhyolite. The American city built in 18 months, abandoned in 15 years, and still standing in the desert. Pull up a satellite map of southern Nevada, north of Las Vegas, near the California state line, and you will see a small grid of empty streets in the middle of nothing. That grid is what is left of an American city. On August 9, 1904, 2 prospectors named Frank Shorty Harris and Ernest Cross found gold-bearing quartz in the Bullfrog Hills of Nye County, Nevada. Within months, a tent camp had formed in a sheltered basin a few miles from the strike. The camp was named Rhyolite for the volcanic rock the gold came out of, and inside a year, the population had reached 5,000, larger than the town of Beatty 4 miles east, the nearest place to Rhyolite today, has ever been. In 1906, the American steel magnate Charles M. Schwab bought the most productive mine in the district for around $5 million. He invested in piped water, electric lines, and a railroad. By the spring of 1907, Rhyolite had 3 newspapers, 50 saloons, an opera house, a stock exchange, a hospital, an 8-room schoolhouse, and a 3-story bank building designed by the Reno architect George E. Holsworth, finished in Italian marble and Honduras mahogany. Then the money ran out. The panic of 1907 hit, the gold ore in the Montgomery Shoshone began to thin, and the mine failures took the rest of the district down. Watch how fast this happens. In 1910, the population had dropped to 675. In 1911, the main mine closed. In 1913, the post office closed. In 1914, the last train pulled out of the station. In 1916, the power company cut the electricity. By the 1920 census, the population of Rhyolite was 14, and yet most of the town is still there. The Cook Bank facade rises 3 stories above open desert, its window frames empty against the sky, photographed by Ansel Adams and 100 others since. The train depot is intact. The school is a roofless shell. And just outside the town limits sits a small home built that same year by an Australian-born stonemason named Tom Kelly. Kelly built it from more than 50,000 discarded beer and medicine bottles mortared together with adobe. And when asked why he chose bottles over timber, he gave one of the great one-line answers in American architectural history. It's very difficult to build a house with lumber from a Joshua tree. His bottle house has now outlasted the town it served by more than a century. Across an open stretch of desert from the bank facade, beginning in 1984, A Polish-born Belgian artist named Albert Szukalski installed the first of 7 outdoor sculptures that would become the Goldwell Open Air Museum. Szukalski had come to the Mojave because he thought it looked like the Holy Land. His first piece, a life-sized recreation of Da Vinci's Last Supper in ghostly white plaster and burlap figures, arranged in a line facing out across the empty desert. He expected to last 2 years in the harsh climate. They are still there 42 years later. Szukalski died in 2000 in Antwerp without ever seeing them deteriorate. An American city of 5,000, with electric lights and Italian marble, lasted 15 years. The buildings that were too solid to move are still there. Beside them stand 12 plaster ghosts an artist made in 1984 because the Mojave reminded him of the Holy Land. Quick pause halfway through. If you're enjoying this so far, consider subscribing and hitting the bell. It genuinely helps. 3 more places coming up. Place 5. The Trona Pinnacles. 500 stone spires that Hollywood has filmed as the surface of alien planets for 30 years. You have almost certainly seen this place. You just didn't know what it was. 20 miles east of Ridgecrest, California, where State Highway 178 gives way to a 5-mile dirt track designated BLM Route 143. The lake bed of Searles Valley spreads out flat and white in the heat. Then the lake bed erupts. More than 500 tufa spires rise from the cracked alkali surface, the tallest of them around 140 feet, about the height of a 14-story building, clustered across 14 square miles. The shapes range from knee-height cones to crooked columns to tombstone slabs. The lake bed surrounding them is bright enough in direct sunlight to make the tallest pinnacles appear to float above the heat shimmer. So what are these things? The answer takes some getting used to. What you are looking at is the bottom of an ancient lake. During the last ice age, the Searles Valley was submerged under Lake Searles, an inland sea up to 640 feet deep, part of a chain of Pleistocene lakes stretching from Mono Lake to Death Valley. Calcium-rich freshwater springs rose up through the lake bed and met the carbonate-rich alkaline water of the lake. Around each spring vent, calcium carbonate precipitated out and built up, slowly, over a period somewhere between 10 and 100,000 years. When the Ice Age ended and the lake evaporated, the towers were left standing in open air. The U.S. Department of the Interior designated the site a National Natural Landmark in 1968. Today, the formations are administered by the Bureau of Land Management and open to anyone willing to drive the dirt road in. 5 miles up that road sits the town of Trona itself, a borax and potash mining settlement of around 2,000 people that has been in slow decline for years, and which was struck hard in July 2019 by a 7.1 magnitude earthquake centered just outside Ridgecrest. The Searles Valley Minerals plant, the only major employer the town has had for decades, announced approximately 300 layoffs in early 2026. The Pinnacles, which have stood for tens of thousands of years, are now outlasting the town that gave them their name. What the Pinnacles have instead, increasingly, is Hollywood. Over 30 film and television productions are shot among the formations every year. In 1989, they played the alien planet Sha-Ka-Ree in Star Trek V. In 2001, Tim Burton filmed Planet of the Apes here. They appear in Battlestar Galactica, in Lost in Space, in Disney's Dinosaur, in the 2nd season of Westworld, and in the Lady Gaga music video for Stupid Love, shot entirely on an iPhone in January 2020 and viewed close to 60 million times. The landscape that registers in the average viewer's mind as the surface of another planet is a dry lake bed in California, formed underwater during the last ice age, still here. Place 6. The Mojave Phone Booth. The desert telephone that briefly became one of the most called numbers on Earth. Okay, this is the place in the video where the story turns properly weird. In 1948, Pacific Bell installed a hand-crank telephone at a remote crossroads in what is now the Mojave National Preserve, at the request of a man named Emerson Ray, who ran the Sema Cinder Mine nearby. The line was officially designated the Cinder Peak Policy Station, part of a California regulatory program requiring phone service for isolated residents. It sat 12 miles from the nearest paved road, 8 miles from the closest building. In the 1960s, the hand crank was replaced with a rotary dial inside a glass and steel booth. By the 1970s, the miners and ranchers it had been installed to serve were mostly gone. The booth remained. The number was 760-733-9969. In May 1997, a man from Tempe, Arizona named Godfrey Daniels was reading a small zine when he came across a letter to the editor. The letter was from a Los Angeles reader who had spotted a phone icon on a Mojave map, driven out to find it, and written down the number. And here is where you have to remember this is happening in 1997. Before smartphones, before social media, Daniels became obsessed. He started calling the number every day, taping each attempt, and pinned a post-it to his bathroom mirror that read, "Did you remember to call the Mojave Desert today?" For nearly a month, nothing answered him but ringing. Then, on June 20th, 1997, around 10 in the morning, he got a busy signal. The first sign that anyone had ever been there. A few days later, he finally got through to a woman named Lorene, a cinder miner who had no phone of her own and used the booth when she needed one. Daniels posted what he had learned to a website. The site went viral on the early internet. Within months, people were dialing 760-733-9969 from around the world, hoping someone in the desert would pick up. Pilgrims drove out to camp beside the booth for days at a time, answering calls themselves. One man from Texas named Rick Carr, who described himself as a spiritual wanderer and told a New York Times reporter he had received orders from the Holy Spirit itself to trek into the desert and answer the phone, stayed for over 30 days, and fielded around 500 calls from strangers in Tokyo, London, and Berlin. Another recurring caller identified himself only as Sergeant Zeno from the Pentagon. No one ever verified his identity. By the spring of 2000, the National Park Service had had enough. They complained to Pacific Bell about visitor impact and unpaid easement fees. And on May 17, 2000, the booth came down. The number was retired. For 3 years at the end of the last century, the most isolated telephone in North America was one of the most connected places on Earth. Place 7. The Amargosa Opera House. The Desert Hall, where a Broadway dancer painted her own audience and performed for them for 44 years. Of all the 7 places in this video, this is the one I keep going back to. Martha Beckett was born in Manhattan on August 9, 1924. She trained in ballet, joined the Corps de Ballet at Radio City Music Hall, and appeared on Broadway in the 1946 revival of Showboat and in Wonderful Town. She married Thomas Williams in 1962. In the spring of 1967, she and Williams were driving through Death Valley when their van got a flat tire at Death Valley Junction, a near-abandoned company town on the eastern edge of the park, founded in 1923 by the Pacific Coast Borax Company as a railroad and worker housing complex for its borax mining operations. While the van was being repaired, Beckett wandered the empty Spanish colonial complex and peered through a window of one of the buildings. She saw a small stage inside an abandoned hall. She said it later in an interview with the Los Angeles Times. "My life split in two at this junction. I looked at the stage and knew it was my future. I knew I'd perform here the rest of my life." The hall she had peered into was called Cork Hill Hall, originally built as a recreation room for Borax Company workers. She leased it for $45 a month, renamed it the Amargosa Opera House, and gave her first performance there on February 10, 1968. The audience in the early years was sometimes zero, so she started painting an audience onto the walls. Figures in Spanish Renaissance dress, nobles, nuns, popes, peasants, royalty in the balconies, more than 200 of them. The walls took 4 years. The ceiling took 2 more. She performed for them every weekend, whether anyone else came or not. Her husband Thomas worked as her manager and stagehand for years, until the early 1980s, when he left her for another woman. He died in 1992. Beckett kept performing. The year her marriage ended, a mime named Tom Willett, a burly man with Einstein hair who performed in an oversized tutu he called a 4-4, joined her as a stage partner and stayed with her until his own death in 2005. In 2000, a filmmaker named Todd Robinson released a feature-length documentary about her life. Simply called Amargosa, it won an Emmy. She kept performing into her 80s, sometimes in pain from osteoporosis, often to sold-out houses of strangers who had driven hours across the desert to see her. Her final performance on her own stage was on February 12, 2012, 44 years to the month after her first. By the end of it, she had performed on that one stage longer than most Broadway careers last from first audition to retirement. She died at her home in Death Valley Junction on January 30, 2017, at the age of 92. The painted audience is still on the walls. More than 100 years ago, Mary Hunter Austin wrote that this long brown land has the lotus charm, that it tricks the sense of time, and that once you have lived in it, you always mean to go away without quite realizing you have not done it. I think about that line a lot. The Mojave is usually described in terms of what it is: the heat, the emptiness, the silence, the long, flat stretches of nothing. But these 7 places are what it contains. An airbase the United States government refused to admit existed for half a century. Rocks that move themselves across a dry lakebed in the dark. A 100-foot stand of stone spires that Hollywood films as alien planets. A wooden dome an aerospace engineer built to instructions he said came from Venus. And a desert hall where a Broadway dancer painted her own audience and performed for them for 44 years. None of them are famous. Most people crossing this desert have no idea they exist. The Mojave is actually the smallest of the 4 major American deserts, but half of what it contains has yet to enter the national conversation. That is what makes the Mojave worth paying attention to. If you made it this far, thank you for spending the time with me. I'd love to hear which of these 7 surprised you the most. Drop it in the comments below and tell me what we missed, because the people who actually live in the Mojave always know places that didn't make this list. And if you enjoyed this one, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so the next video finds you when it's ready.